Hi. Well, this chapter we're going to focus on preschoolers. But first, we're going to explore some basic about cognitive development, including Piaget, and then we're going to explore a few other folks, and lastly, we're going to take a look at language development. So let's get to it. So Piaget is this theorist who introduced this concept called schemas. Now, schema is both a category of knowledge as well as a process of acquiring that knowledge. Um, when we think of schemas, we have to kind of think of a cognitive framework or a concept that helps us organize and interpret information. Piaget believed that people are constantly adapting to the environment as they take in this new information, and this is how we learn new things. So schemas, they're really useful because they allow us to sort of make a shortcut in interpreting this vast amount of data and information that's constantly available to our environment. If you think about a preschooler, they have had very little interactions with the world, and yet they've got to very quickly begin to understand what's going on. So, as experiences happen and new information is presented, new schemas are constantly developed, and these old schemas are changed or even modified. However, this sort of mental framework also causes us to maybe exclude certain information and to focus only on things that confirm our sort of pre-existing beliefs and ideas. So schemas can contribute to stereotypes, unfortunately, and it makes it difficult sometimes to retain new information if it doesn't conform to what we already know. So let's just take sort of a look of how a schema might occur. So first we have to start out with our senses. Our brain doesn't have anything in it. It's got to be brought in. So in this case, this preschooler, let's say, is paying attention to a physical aspect. In this case, it's a dog. And they notice the ears and the eyes and the nose, and it goes woof, woof. And so that information then is coming in to their brain, and we know because they're using their eyeballs that is going into the optical lobe, and then we probably also can smell the dog. So that's going into one. I'm sorry, that was hear the dog go woof woof. I know the difference between a nose and an ear sometimes. And we can smell the dog, and we can even pet the dog, and all of that information is going to be going into this nice, in this case, little brain, because we're a preschooler, so we don't really have a lot of brain matter yet. But once we've got all that information in the brain, we now have sort of an image, a mental image of what a dog is. And so now when I'm presented with a bunch of different animals, I'm going to be able to say, well, the dog is this one because it looks like my image of what I think a dog is, or it smells like it, or it barks like it. And when I look at these other things, they don't look like a dog. A unicorn definitely doesn't look like a dog, and this little toy blow up thing right here, I can pop that and I can't pop a dog. So what we've created is sort of this mental framework, this mental skeleton of what we think a dog is. And we literally kind of wire that into our brain. Those neurons that we have and those neurotransmitters, they all work together to create this little bit of knowledge. And now we're going to use that knowledge every time we run into an animal to determine if it's a dog, because we've created a schema of what we think dogs are. So Frederick Bartlett, he comes along after Freud, and he really refines the schema theory. Now, most of today's work on schemas comes from his work. He inspired many of the modern versions of schema theory. So, Bartlett describes a schema as an active organization of past events. He states that all new information interacts with old information, and that represents a schema. So you use schemas to interpret your sensory data. You retrieve information from your memory. You organize actions. Hopefully, eventually, you solve some problems. You know, if we really look at schemas, they're really just kind of like this skeleton structure of knowledge. So as we move forward, you have to kind of look at schemas in a way to be an effective aspect of life that helps us move through. Um, However, preschoolers, see, they're just developing these schemas. You're using them all the time. I mean, you've got your social schemas, you've got your restaurant schemas, you've got your dog schemas. You've defined and have them well defined so you can use them on tap to access your knowledge really quickly. But first we have to develop them. And so that's what preschoolers spend a lot of time on. They're going to be developing their schemas. So as we develop the schemas, we're creating our own version of reality also, in a sense, in that we use schemas to help us define the world as we view it. So I grew up on the beach, on the island, and for me, I have a schema of what the landscape should look like and what rain should look like. And it's always interesting to me when I leave the state and I go to, let's say, Maryland to visit my cousin, and she's like, oh, it's going to rain bad. And I'm all ready for the bad rain. And she's like, oh, look how bad it's raining. And I'm thinking, well, that's just like a little shower for us. And she came down here one time and I said, oh, we're going to have some bad rain. And she's like, oh, we can go out anyway. And I said, well, no, you haven't seen bad rain. And so she saw some of that Florida sideways rain and kind of looked at me and she said, well, no wonder you thought our rain wasn't really rain. I said, yeah, this is rain. So her scheme of what rain was and my scheme of what rain is were very different. And so each one of us sort of created our own reality of when we said something was going to be a rainy day, what that sort of looked like. So in 2000, Peter C.R. Lane, now it's important because there's a lot of Peter Lanes out there, and he's a professor of computer science. And you wouldn't think of computer science and psychology going together, but schemas are really important in computer science because remember, they're shortcuts, so the ways we know things. It's how come icons and GUIs and all that were put together. So he stated that a schema is a cognitive structure for representing and retrieving classes of typical situations for which similar responses is required for the learner. That sounds like a lot of goobly gop, but basically what he's saying is that the advantage of having schema knowledge is that we can oftentimes just kind of rely on this default knowledge we already have. This really comes in handy when we have to make intelligent or really quick guesses about something that we may not really have a lot of specific knowledge on, or maybe even time to really look at. So you could argue that a schema are sort of like these little theories or memos about our own reality, and also the reality that allows us to follow a certain script, sort of how we do things. Again, it's important to understand that a fairly big chunk of knowledge in our brain is organized around routine events. And so if we're talking about routine events, we can talk about a particular type of schema called a script. Now, the scripts are basically just a sequence of events that make up some well-known routine activities. So, as an example, if you were to go to, let's say, a McDonald's, there's sort of a script of how you do that. You know where you walk in the door, you know you go up to the counter, you already may even know what you're going to order, but you look up at the menu anyway just to make sure they didn't change things. You order your food, you wait for it at a certain location, and you go sit down. You didn't have to think much about it because these scripts have these standard roles and props and conditions, and you expect certain results from them. So let's take sort of a look at a script. So let's say that I was to ask you, what are all the things you need to know to unscrew lug nuts? And so this first one over here is basically just saying, here are the things you need to know. So this would be in a type of memory, the semantic memory, of all the different little things you need to know to unscrew a lug nut. However, just knowing to put away the jack and, taking off the hubcap, that doesn't actually get the actual item done. What you need to understand beyond just this basic knowledge is actually the series of events that it takes place in order to take the car tire off. So we got to take out the jack, position the jack, take off the hubcap, because if this isn't done exactly this way, we aren't going to get basically the tire off, or it's going to take us a lot longer to get the tire off. So what we're saying is that you have sort of this schema of sequence of events of how to do this. And now the reason this is kind of neat is that if you think about it, a lot of your life is basically a sequence of events. You know how to drive home. You've got that event already in your head. And this is one reason why you get really upset when they put a detour up. even if the detour doesn't take you any extra time or maybe even save you a little time, you're still not really happy with the detour. Why? Because it's changed your sequence of events. It's changed your schema. It's changed how you think you should do things. Now, for an adult, we've got all these little shortcuts already developed for ourselves. But remember, we're talking about preschoolers. They don't have this yet. They don't even know what 2/3 of this stuff is. So a lot of energy for preschoolers is spent just creating these things in their heads, creating their little shortcuts, you might want to say. Which brings us then to basically schemas and perception. Now, we covered perception in the last chapter, and we said perception was basically the brain receiving and processing and modifying and organizing all these sensory inputs. And if we think about it, that's sort of what a schema is. It's selecting and modifying, organizing events. So if a correct schema is activated, then the individual can basically compare what they see to what their memory has, and boom, they get a satisfactory result. But if people are unable to activate the right schema, then their comprehension of the information can suffer. They even eventually fail to act or respond adequately, quite often, to situations that they face in everyday life. I mean, think about what happens to a person who receives the wrong cues, and then basically they're going to make a mistake, and an inappropriate schema may even come up, an inappropriate system of activities. So the activation of a context in which the appropriate schema really does help people be able to recall situations better from their memory and prepare them for sort of adequate responses. We use this cognitive and perceptual reaction in our mind to help us move through everyday life. So my example of how we're talking about this is that we use a lot of clues and cues to help us move through. We get used to things being certain ways. So I have lived beachside pretty much my entire life, but then just for a little while, I went up to Baltimore and Atlanta. Got to try the big city at some point in your life. And so when I came back, it was really kind of funny because for my entire childhood and my entire driverhood and my entire 20s, I drove up and down A1A over here in Brevard County. And there was a causeway called the Pineda Causeway. Now, I'm so old, I remember when there wasn't a Pineda Causeway when it was built. But what we would do is you would drive up the road and we would see, or I would see, this mechanic place where they repaired cars. And when I saw that, I knew I was getting ready for the Pineda and I was going to have to get over to turn in to the right lane to get, well, it would be the left lane, but the correct lane to be able to turn onto the Pineda Causeway. And if you missed that, then you wound up in Patrick Air Force Base. Well, for years and years and years, that's what I did. Now I'm receiving the information, but this time after having been gone for a couple of years, I came back and I'm driving up to Cocoa Beach, and all of a sudden I look over and I'm like, wait a minute, that's the Air Force Base. How did I miss the Pineda Causeway? Because you see, I wanted to go to Vieira, and I couldn't figure out how I managed to miss the Pineda Causeway. And that's because my perception was looking for the correct information for my schema, which is there would be this repair shop. And then when I saw the repair shop, that was time to activate, getting ready to move over. But the repair shop had been knocked down and it wasn't there anymore. And some other building had taken its place. So I had basically the incorrect schema, and thus I couldn't make the appropriate decision to get over lanes to turn. So I wound up at Patrick Air Force Base, and anybody who lives near here means you drive a long way before you can turn around and go back to the causeway. So that's what we're sort of talking about when we talk about schemas and perception, because my perception, was that I had to look for and receive basically this clue through my eyes and then back into my optical lobe to sort of activate the right schema. So we can look at it this way too. Let's talk about a chair. So what's going to happen is that you're going to perceive this chair by basically your sensory inputs, and your sensory inputs are going to use your eyes and all those things. And so what you're doing is you're over here looking at the fact that the chair is, wood and it's got a back on it, and there's four little legs right there. There are all kinds of things that you're looking at that are helping you basically perceive this chair, and you've now created a schema. So you can imagine a chair now in your head because you were able to get some physical perceptions of what a chair is. So now you have a schema of a chair. Now think about a little, you know, 3-year-old who is trying to create images in their head because they don't have them yet. They've never interacted with certain things. So being a Florida child, I've never really interacted with a snow ski. But if I was 3 years old and you're asking me about a ski, how am I supposed to even get an image? How am I even supposed to get a schema about what a ski is? Well, you tell me it's about snow, which I don't understand anyway at 3 because I've never seen it. So I'm going to have a very hard time making a schema. The same way that somebody who perhaps in Montana who's young, may not really be able to conceptualize what a surfboard is or what the surf is like because we haven't had that opportunity to create those schemas. However, as we get a little bit older, I get an opportunity to watch on TV the Olympics, let's say, and I see skiers there. And I'm talking to my mother and she says, "Oh, they're skiing." And those are skis. You see how long they are. And some other kid is watching TV and he sees surfing and his parents are like, "Oh, that's a surfboard and that's the shape they are." And so what's happening is the preschoolers are beginning to create their schemas from the images that they're seeing. So when I later come down to or my friend comes down from the north and they bring their kid, the kid wants to touch the surfboard and see what it's like because he has this image. And maybe when he sees a surfboard, it's a lot bigger than he thought it was because when he saw it on TV, it did not look very big. Of course, he's 3, so he doesn't quite get that images on TV might be different than the size they actually see them. And so he has to change his schema, his perception of what this is. But the original perception was only based on visual information. So it's kind of a neat but complex way that we do this, but they're very important to us in moving forward in our cognitive development, especially if we think about a kid who's got none of it yet. So Piaget, just to kind of give you a little background on him, he's hired by the Binet Institute in the 1920s. Now you may know the word Binet because we talk about IQ tests and the Stanford Binet or Binet, depends on which, if you're doing French or American version of the word, is sort of this very large IQ test. But he's been hired by the Binet Institute to basically develop a French version of the questions that were written in English, because this was all written in English. So he becomes very intrigued as he's doing this, and the reason why children are giving the wrong answers to the questions that require logical thinking. Now, he begins to believe that these incorrect answers really reveal very important information between the thought patterns of children versus the thought patterns of adults. Now, the other thing you have to realize is that when you're converting anything from one language to another, there's also a contextual aspect of this conversion. So again, being somebody who grew up here in Florida on the beach, it was very interesting to me. I can remember this being very young, reading a book, and the book talks about the child seeing the steeple, and they had to go find the steeple in order to find their way home. And I had no idea what a steeple was. And I remember saying to my teacher, "What's a steeple? Does that have something to do with horses?" Because I'm thinking stable. And my instructor laughs a little bit. She says, "It's the thing on top of the church." And I go, "Well, that's a cross." And she goes, "No, it's this pointy thing." And so she finds this picture of a church from up north. And I go, "Well, none of our churches have that." And that's because down here, they get blown off in hurricanes. So people didn't build steeples, at least not any of the churches that I was familiar with in my neighborhood. So my schema did not match that of the book. And so if I had been given a test question on that, the question would be why didn't I know that? And so Piaget was sort of doing the same thing. What he what he saw was that experience happened and that new information was presented. So I was presented with new information that there was this thing on top of the church that had a bell in it. And these new schemas were developed. Like I just developed a new schema, and old schemas were changed or modified. So he wanted to understand that process though. So the process through which schemas are adjusted or changed are known as assimilation and accommodation. And so in a simulation, new information is incorporated into sort of these pre-existing schemas. And a schema may be altered or new schemas may be informed as a person learns this new information and has this new experience. So Piaget would call that accommodation. So let's sort of take a look at how that might occur. So we've got this little boy over here, and he knows what the schema of a cat is. He goes, meow, meow, furry. They seem to like me. I don't like them because, well, I'm allergic to them. And so he goes to the zoo with his sister. And when he's at the zoo, he sees this neat little animal. And he says, cat, cat, cat. And why does he say cat? Because to him, a cat is furry and it has 4 legs and it has little whiskers. And you know what? This is furry. It's got 4 legs. It's got little whiskers. So he's using his schema to say that that's a cat. But of course, his sister, being the good sister she is, she corrects him and she says, no, 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 not a cat. This is a cub. It's a tiger cub. And so he has to assimilate that there's a difference between this kitty cat and this tiger. And so when he assimilates that information, what he's done is he has accommodated. So now he has 2 schemas. The first schema is about cats, and the second schema is a tiger cub. So that's the process that Piaget believed that we went through as we began to learn new things. So schemas can help simplify our world. And that's probably one of the things that really is the most useful about them. So they can make it easier for people to also learn about the world around them. New information could be classified and categorized and compared to new existing or existing schemas we already have. So that allows us to quickly learn information and more readily fit what we've got into our existing schemas. So schemas influence also what we pay attention to. People are more likely to pay attention to things that fit into their current schemas. And if it fits into how I think something's going to work, I'll fit that in there too. They also allow us to think quickly. Basically, under conditions when things are rapidly changing and we have this new information coming to us, people don't usually spend a great deal of time trying to interpret that information. They bring it in and they adjust. Because of these existing schemas, people are able to assimilate this new information quickly and somewhat automatically. So in a way, you can think about just this class. This class is going to run perhaps a little differently than other online classes because this wasn't originally developed as an online class. It was developed to be a face-to-face class. So things are going to work a little bit differently. And you quickly adjusted to that. You've been able to say, oh, here's what the schema is, and here's how it's going to work. And thus, you're going to move forward. And lastly, we say schemas can also change how we interpret incoming messages. Basically, when we're learning new information that doesn't fit with existing schemas, people will sometimes distort, maybe even alter the new information to make it fit with what they already know. And this is where we can get really cultural differences. You can say that I'm used to doing it this way, and then I come over here and you do it a different way. I always like traveling and trying food. And it's always interesting about the smell of food because what I might consider to be wonderfully smelling food, other cultures may find to be horribly smelling food, and vice versa. And that's because we learned to appreciate the smell of certain foods based on it being cooked and being served within our houses. So what will happen is someone may serve me something. It may actually want to taste wonderful, but because it smells in a certain way and I have a certain schema of food that would be bad, I'm not going to even try the food or maybe the look of it. I've always joked that I won't eat guacamole because it's something I would never even think about stepping in. So how am I going to be able to change my schema if I don't adjust it in some way. So, it changes how we interpret incoming information. They're really interesting things. And as you begin to explore more about schemas, you'll begin to realize how many are out there and how many actually influence a lot of what you already think about because they're all internally in you. But remember, the preschoolers don't really have them yet. They're kind of blank slates. So as they experience life, as they experience what's going on, they're going to start to create some schemas. And those schemas may stay with them for the rest of their lives. So we also know that schemas tend to be easy to change during childhood, but they become increasingly rigid and very difficult to modify as people grow older. Now, schemas will often persist even when people are presented with evidence that are contrary to their belief. In many cases, people will only begin to slowly change their schemas when they're basically inundated with contradictory information and evidence pointing to needing modification. So they'll stick with what they have unless it's overwhelming. And then, even then, sometimes they just basically push it aside. So there was this really interesting study that I like to use to sort of explain how schemas are easy to change or not change. So researchers found a whole bunch of kids and they showed them two sets of images. They also wanted to know how stereotyped they were about gender roles. So they either were given consistent images consistent with gender expectations, such as a man working on a car and women perhaps washing dishes, while another set of people were given what we call gender inconsistent stereotypes. We had the man washing dishes and the woman fixing a car. A little later, we asked the children to remember what they had seen in the images. Now, remember, I said there were two groups of children. Those children who were very stereotyped in their view of what gender roles were and what gender did were more likely to change the gender of the people they saw in the gender inconsistent photos. So basically what we're saying is that if this child had a very strong vision of what a man does or what a woman does, even if they saw an image of a woman fixing a car, when asked later, they would say a man was fixing a car. Or when they were asked later who was washing the dishes, they would say the woman was washing the dishes. Because they already had very strong schemas of who did what, and they actually just changed it. Now, those who did not have strong schemas tended to give the more accurate answers. So, what's interesting is that Piaget believed that intellectual growth was a process of adaptation and adjustment to the world through this, we already talked about, process of assimilation and accommodation. So remember, assimilation is using current schemas to deal with some sort of new object or situation. So think about the tiger cub. Accommodation happens when the current schemas change because of this new knowledge. We adapt our schema to incorporate this new information. But the new things we have here is equilibrium. Now, equilibrium is a force that Piaget thought moved development forward. He believed that cognitive development did not progress at a steady rate, but rather it kind of went in leaps and bounds. So, equilibrium occurs when a child's schema or a child can deal with most of the new information through assimilation. I already know what things are, we're going along happily. However, an unpleasant state of disequilibrium occurs when the new information can't fit into our existing schema. So we have to do something about that. We're going to have to assimilate some information. Now, equilibrium is forced. Equilibrium is a force, I should say, which drives the learning process. As we don't really like being frustrated, and little kids really don't like being frustrated. So what they're going to do is they're going to seek this balance again between the current and the new information. And by mastering this new information, they're going to accommodate or basically change their schema. And once the new information is acquired, the process of assimilation with the new schema will continue until next time we need to make adjustments to it. So as normal, let's kind of go back and walk this through with our example. So we've got the boy and his sister and the cat. his current schema of what a cat was perfectly happy, and he was in equilibrium. Everything was going along fine. Now he goes to the zoo with his sister, and he has this new situation. So right here, this is where he is now, a new situation. And he thinks that the cat is at the zoo, and he points to it and look at this cool little cat. And the sister has said, no, 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 that is a tiger. Well, he's now in disequilibrium because the current schema of what a cat is does not match what a tiger is. And he's a little upset, maybe not big upset, but just enough that he says, wait a minute, if this is not what a cat is, I either have to change my knowledge, my schema of a cat, and or I'm going to be a little upset. And so after a little bit, he might go, oh, okay, I get it now. That's a tiger and that's a cat. And so this disequilibrium basically forced him to accommodate the new schema. And now he's got this wonderful new schema that a cat and a tiger is different. And so, boop, 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 he's actually got two perhaps. And then the next time he sees, oh, what's another one that we can do? A cheetah. And he looks at the cheetah and says, tiger. And now the sister has got to say, nope, cheetah. And so again, he has to, sort of change because he's got again another new situation. And the current schema he has doesn't work. And so he will go all the way through this again. Now, what's interesting is if we really think about this, what Piaget said is that this is not something that just happens to little kids, but basically you do this all the time. That anytime you get information that doesn't quite match your schema, you're going to have to either change that information or you're going to perhaps have a level of frustration. And you can see a lot of adults, especially when we start talking about older adults, get into frustration. Now, you may call it stubbornness. I don't see it that way. I see it as a fact that you have not yet convinced them that it's worth changing. Because after all, their schema says we do it this way. I've been doing it this way for 50 years, so why should I change? One of the things that has happened recently is that cash is getting to be used less and less and less, and more charge cards are being used, or online banking is being used. And older people, they're used to cash. They like cash. They know how cash works. They know exactly how much money they have. They don't have to pay a debt. And so as people are starting to say they won't take cash, older people are getting upset. They're like, why won't you take cash? Cash is perfectly good. But a lot of places don't want to deal with cash. And the older people are finding that to be not something they want to do because to them, cash is easy. I've got a $20 bill. You got $11 worth of groceries. I'm done. I pay you. I get the change. I don't have to worry about anything else. Because what they see a charge card means is that I have to now go home, wait for this bill to come. I have to write a check. Or I have to go online and I have to make another payment. So the bill is still there. The stress of still having to pay that is still there. And so they do not see this as a superior way of doing things. They see it as just stretching out the stress. And so a lot of times when you're talking with older individuals, that's something you have to think about is that their schemas are working for them and they've worked for them for, 50 years. So unless you can really convince them on why they need to make that change, why the change really would be good, it can be very difficult for them to change their schemas because you can't say it isn't working because it has been. So with Piaget, he has these four sort of developmental stages. Now, in this particular week, we're going to talk about sensorimotor and preoperational period, and next week we'll talk about the concrete and the formal operation. So during the initial phase of development, Piaget said kids utilize their skills and abilities that they're basically born with, such as suckling and grasping and listening. And they use these to learn more about their environment. In other words, they experience the world and gain knowledge through their senses and by motoring around, because the world doesn't come to you, you have to go to the world. It's through some trial and error that kids will discover more about their world around them. So Piaget called this stage sensorimotor because it was through their sensors and through their motor abilities that infants gain this basic understanding of the world. And that ability that infants is born with, sight, hearing, taste, they all combine with these physical capacities that they have and they continue to develop, including things like touching and grasping and tasting. That allows the infant to sort of interact and build this awareness of themselves and also what's around them. So remember last week, or not last week, in chapter 3, we talked about the development of self, the development of self-awareness, and a lot of that has to do with having these interactions as we sort of move through those first 2 years of life. Also remember that we don't really have a perception of knowledge those first 2 years. That theory of self really does come back into play, because in the series Self, we realize that 2-year-olds are just beginning to understand that little voice in their head, it's not even a voice, but those sounds in their head is their sounds. Up until now, they didn't get that. They didn't even get what the sounds meant anyway. And they're just getting what the sounds are, and they're beginning to understand that sound is my sound. And it's not until 3 that they can actually kind of control that sound. Before that, that sound just came to them. At 3, that sound is something they begin to control. And it's not until 4 do they believe or realize that other people have different sounds. To them, whatever's in their head is the same thing that everybody else has. So this is going to be kind of an interesting time, and this is one of the things that Piaget kind of noticed. Now, because the brain of between a 0 and 2-year-old is dramatically changing in that time frame, it never changes as much as it does right then. What Piaget actually said is that there's a whole bunch of like substages to this particular time frame. So the first substage, basically the first month of life, is basically reflexes. I mean, the response that little kids are having are to external stimuluses, and they're innate reflexes. For example, if you brush a baby's mouth or its cheek with your finger, it will suck as a reflex. If you put your finger in the middle of their palm, you got the Palmer effect. And you saw those in chapter 3, and he says, this is basically how they're discovering their world at first. Now, the second substage is a stage of what they call primary circular reactions. Here, what will happen is the baby is going to start repeating pleasurable actions, but it's almost always centered on their own body. So, a 1 to 4 month old begins to wiggle their fingers and kick their legs and suck their thumbs. These aren't really reflexes. They're done internally. They're done for the sake of pleasure and the fun of doing it, you might want to say. So after that comes the secondary circular reaction. This only typically goes between about 4 and 8 months. Now what babies are doing is they're repeating a pleasurable action like they did in the other one, but it tends to involve objects outside their bodies, not just their bodies. So I get a rattle and I like that rattle and I'll shake that rattle because I have a pleasure of just hearing the sound that it makes. Or I chew on something because I like the pleasure of the taste of the object. Of course, I could also be teething, but this secondary circular, but the big difference is that in the first one, it's about my body, and the second one, it's going to be about objects outside of me. Now, on the fourth one, we have this coordination of reactions. And this one is 8 to 12 months. And at this stage, we're coordinating secondary schemas. Instead of simply prolonging an interesting event, babies now show signs of the ability to use their acquired knowledge to reach a goal. For example, an infant will not just shake the rattle, but now will reach out and knock to one side an object with it that stands in the way of perhaps either getting to the rattle or holding the rattle. This is also a time when anybody who's had a kid knows that the kids will sit at their high chair and drop something off to watch it happen because they just think that's kind of fun. That also, by the way, can be part of the tertiary circle reaction. This is the trial and error. So why they're dropping it off, there could be one or two things. It could be that they're just getting fun of watching something fall. Um, imitate a scene behavior, or it could be that they're doing trial and error. Like if I drop it from here and it falls down, will it come back? And it didn't. And I want it back. Mom! And we get a little cry, and mom runs over and picks up the little bottle and gives it back to him. And about 2 seconds later, they drop it. And it didn't come back. Mom! And they keep doing this over and over again. But basically, they're just using trial and experimenting what does and doesn't work within their environment, you might want to say. So the infant who has explored the object will take it now apart, perhaps maybe and try to put it together. So think about bricks or blocks. Now they put blocks in the truck that they might have, and then they push the truck somewhere and they take it back out, and they keep working with these blocks one place to another. Are they like nesting cups at this point? Put the cups in, take the cups out. They just enjoy sort of this trial and error. What will happen? This is a big time when you can get those toys where if you push the button, something pops up, and different buttons you push, different things pop up, and they get really happy with this. The problem is it doesn't last for very long because they've experienced the trial and error and they want to sort of move on. Now, the last one is sort of the most important because this is going to happen somewhere between 18 and 24 months. And basically, what we're beginning here is symbolic thought. Now, this is a transition between the current stage they're in and the next stage, which is going to be called preoperational. And it's a huge cognitive development steps. So babies up until now haven't really been able to form mental images, we don't think. But at this point, they're going to be able to start forming mental representations of an object. That means that they've developed the ability to visualize something that are not just physically in front of them. Now, this is really crucial for the acquisition of something called object permanence. That's the most fundamental achievement in the whole sensory stage, and we'll talk about that next. Without basically symbolism, they're not going to really move forward because up until now, everything that they know has come in through their senses. But if you think about it, not everything that you learn comes in through your senses. We have to be able to use symbols. And symbols are words, they're letters, they're eyebrow raises, they're anything that isn't basically through our senses to help us understand the world and to move ahead. So Piaget thought that, once they sort of begin to get symbolism, that we're going to see them move beyond just using their senses to get information. But let's take a look at that sensory motor object permanence, because we said that this was a very important aspect, probably the most important aspect that's going to occur in this first sensory motor part of life. So the term object permanence is used to describe a child's ability to know that an object continues to exist even though they can no longer see it or perhaps even hear it. So during early infancies, babies are extremely egocentric. They have no concept that the world exists separately from their own viewpoint and their own experiences. So to understand that an object continues to exist even when they are unseen, that's really a big leap. So infants first must develop a mental representation of that object before they can do this. So how do we determine if an object permanence is present? Well, what Piaget would do is he would show this toy to an infant before hiding it or taking it away. In one version of the experiment, Piaget would hide the toy under a blanket and then observe to see if the infant would search for the object. Now, some infants would appear to be confused or upset with the loss, while other infants instead would look for the object. Piaget believed that the infants who were upset that the toy was gone lacked the understanding of object permanence, while those who searched for the toy had reached that developmental milestone. Now, in Piaget's experiment, this tends to occur somewhere between 8 and 9 months. However, some recent findings have sort of re-looked at this. Piaget's theory was enormously influential and remains quite popular today, but it's also sort of a subject of some criticism. Now, one of the major criticisms of Piaget's work is that it often underestimates the children's abilities. Some research on object permanence has also called into question some of Piaget's conclusions. Researchers have been able to demonstrate that with a cue, a child as young as 4 months has been able to show what looks to be object permanence. And that's usually the biggest sort of negative criticism, is that things may happen a little younger than Piaget knew. But what is interesting is that when we talk about the criticism of Piaget, it's generally not that his concept was wrong. It's just that the age of the concept may be different. So looking at this little child, hopefully you can determine whether or not you think this child does or does not have object permanence. Well, we want to take a look at the second face. And does this child look like he understands that the little animal is hiding behind that blue or white folder or whatever it is that they've got there? Doesn't to me. It doesn't look like he's got object permanence at all. He doesn't see it. It's gone. He looks confused. And so Piaget would say he does not yet have object permanence, which means he does not yet have the ability to make a mental representation of the object, because what he doesn't see doesn't exist. So the preoperational stage occurs roughly between 2 and 7 years of age. Now, language development is one of the hallmarks of this period. Just like in the last period, we had object permanence. Now, Piaget noted that children in this stage do not yet understand concrete logic. They can't mentally manipulate information. Basically, they're unable to take the viewpoint of other people, which he termed as egocentrism, because they were focused on just what they saw and what they knew. Now, during the preoperational stage, children also become increasingly adept at using symbols, as evident by the increase in playing and pretending that they do. For example, a child is able to use an object to represent something else now. So they can take a cardboard box and pretend it's a car. We can take some tinfoil, put it around their heads, and be an astronaut. In fact, role playing becomes sort of very important to them at this point. They may play mommy or doctor or pilot or many other characters that they see, or they'll use their dolls and their toys to play those roles. But much of the focus of Piaget at this stage is focusing on what children could not yet do. The concept of egocentrism and conservatism, which we'll talk about next, are both sort of central on the abilities that children have not yet developed. So they lack this understanding that things, they look different than that things that they see may look different than what other people see, and that objects can change in appearance while still maintaining the same property. They are basically sort of using this time to build experiences that they will later use to help them through lives. Basically, it's a huge schema building time period. Now, there were several key features that Piaget talks about during this time period. And centralization is the tendency for children to focus on one aspect of a situation at a time. Now, when a child can focus on more than one aspect of a situation at the same time, they've developed something called decenter. But during this stage, during this preoperational stage, children really have difficulty thinking about more than one thing or one aspect of any situation they're looking at. They may have trouble decentralizing in social situations, just like they do in non-social situations. So a classic example is the two cups. So here we have cup A and cup B, and as we look at it as adults, we can see that they are equal in height. And if we were to ask the child, does cup A or cup B have more liquid, or are they the same? They would say, well, they're the same because they look the same in height. Now, we could tell that same child, what I'd like you to do is to take cup B, and I would like you to take this, and I would like you to take and pour it right there into cup C. Or maybe they watch me pour it, depending on how well they are at pouring. And now what they see is this image over here. And now we ask them the same question that we had before. Does basically cup A or does cup C have more liquid in it, or are they the same? And they will say pretty much every time that C has more liquid in it. Now, you and I know that it must have the same amount of liquid in it because we saw that earlier we had poured cup B into C, and A and B had the same thing. We didn't add anything extra, we just took and pour it. But that's sort of concrete operation and logic that is being used. And these kids just don't have it at that time. In fact, you can have them take and pour it back into this cup so it fills it up to that line. And they will tell you that now it is the same. And even if they pour it back and forth, they don't get it at first. Now, there is some evidence that if they do this enough times, they might get it. But basically, they're just centered on one thing, which is the height. And so we talked about the fact that they don't have the ability to look at multiple things at once. And so they can't decenter, so they only see height. Now, in your book, you'll see some examples of other ones a couple of pages back. Now, egocentrism basically says that children's thoughts and communications are generally just about themselves. Egocentrism refers to the child's inability to see situations from another person's point of view. Now, remember I said a child's inability. It's not that they don't want to. They can't. Their little brains don't let them. We have to keep remembering where they are. These, especially preoperational people, are 2 to 7. At 2, we just figured out who we were. We just got the concept of self. And now between 2 and 3, we're just getting the concept that the voice in our head is our voice. So that's that theory of the mind. And at 3, we're beginning to make our first mental operations. So we're beginning to create objects in our head we can begin to visualize. And then only until we're 4, and sometime after 4, do we begin to realize that other people may see things differently than us. This is one reason why we call them the terrible 2s and the horrific 3s, because they get frustrated. They think that you think like them. And I don't care how many times you tell them you don't. They don't get that because, you see, they've only heard one voice in their entire life, and that's the voice in their head. And so everything revolves around the way they see things. So it's kind of fun. You get a 3-year-old, you'll go up a couple floors and have dad come to the door, and you say to the 3-year-old, "Hey, Louis, what do you think dad is looking at right now? What does dad see?" And Louis will look down at dad and go, "Oh, dad sees the top of his head." Now, you and I know that dad can't see the top of his head, but he'll think that dad sees the top of his head because dad sees the same thing that Louis sees, which is the top of his head. Now, if we ask his sister Mary, who is now 5 years old, what does dad see? She'll roll her eyes at us and go, "A door, duh." Because you see, by now she's able to understand that other people have different points of view. They can see things differently. But that 3-year-old, they will fight with you that what dad sees is the top of his head. Now, according to Piaget, the egocentric child assumes that other people also will hear and feel the same thing that they do. The next thing he talks about is symbolic representation. Now, this is really kind of the big thing. Early preoperational period is marked by this dramatic increase in the child's use of symbol functions. And when we talk about symbols, we're not just talking about shapes and sizes, but understand that words are symbols. Objects are symbols. When we use one thing to stand for something else, that's a symbol. And we'll talk about language a little bit later on, but you have to understand that the word cat is a symbol. It's a representation of that furry four-legged creature. I don't actually have the furry four-legged creature, but I'm talking to you right now, and I want you to think about the same thing I'm going to talk about. And so I've got to use some sort of a symbol to represent that animal. And so it's cat. Now, in the English language, we've agreed sort of that the word cat will represent that symbol. But if I go to another country and I want to talk about that little furry creature, and let's say I go to, I don't know, Venezuela, where Spanish is spoken, which is like the 3rd most popular language in the world, and I say cat, they may look at me rather oddly because that's not a cat to them. They're going to say gato. And gato is the symbolic representation in Spanish for cat. It's the same symbolic representation. They're using a different sound than I'm using, but we're both using a symbol to represent that little animal. And if you had come and found me when I was a little kid, maybe 3 or 4, and you asked me what that little furry creature was, for some reason I called it a waka waka. I guess because it walked around. And so I, as a small child, had my own symbolic representation. And you know that there are little kids who create their own language. It's called a private language all the time, and it has their own meaning to them. So my small child, when he was little, we figured out finally that the word maca meant good. And he'd put maca in front of everything, including his friend. She wasn't Elizabeth, she was Macabeth, Macabear. Maca this, Maca that. If it was something that was good, it had the word Maca in front of it for a long time because that was his symbolic representation that it was good. So it was just an apple that meant it was okay or not good. But if it was a Maca orange, oh, that was a good orange. So all he was doing was using his own symbolic representation to help facilitate communication. And this is what happens at this age. They're beginning to really figure this out. So if we don't have it, we're not going to develop language. So language is perhaps the most obvious form of symbolicism that young children will display. However, Piaget also argues that language does not facilitate cognitive development, which is kind of interesting. But what he says is that language merely reflects what a child already knows and actually contributes very little to new knowledge at this age. He basically believed that cognitive development promoted language, not that language promoted cognitive development. So basically what he's saying is that my kid had to understand that an orange and that an orange was good, and that the way he communicated that was by the creation of language. But he already had to have the concept of good, and he already had to have the concept of an orange. I already had to have the concept of what a cat was. In order for me to communicate that, I had to use language. So language did not make my development of my knowledge better. Language just simply allowed me to communicate the cognitive development that I already had. This one's kind of fun because what he said is that these kids between 3 and 7, maybe a little more on the younger side, they tend to believe that certain aspects of the environment are manufactured by people. Things like clouds in the sky. And so you might say, well, how can they believe we do this? Well, if you think about it, again, we're talking about little kids who don't have any schemas, and they look around. To them, the environment is everything. That includes the buildings, the bridges, the roads, and yet humans, they know, make the bridges, the buildings, the roads, so why wouldn't humans make the clouds too? And it's really hard to explain to them that that lake is made naturally and that pond was built by a human. So it gets really confusing to them, but for a while they kind of think that we can create almost all the elements that are out there. The other one that's a little bit hard for maybe adults to handle is the inability to reverse a sequence of events. Now we know what a sequence of events is, step A, B, C, D. But what's interesting is that they have the inability to change the direction. So if I know how to change a tire, I can probably work backwards on doing that. They can't do that. And so it's kind of funny when you ask them about growing plants because their secret events tends to be how they see things. So the fruit may come first and then they have to give it water. And you're like, well, you have to plant it first. Well, they didn't see planting. This is also where I call it the peanut butter and jelly challenge. For 6 days in a row, this kid has wanted peanut butter and jelly for lunch. And on day 7, you just make peanut butter and jelly. You put it in front of them and they go, I hate peanut butter and jelly. You're like, you've just eaten it for the last 6 days, honey. Don't tell me you hate peanut butter and jelly. No, I've never liked peanut butter and jelly. I've always hated peanut butter and jelly. And parents can lose their temper at this point. But what it is the kid can't go backwards. First of all, they don't really have much of a memory system at all. In fact, it's very little to nothing. And so not only do they not have memory, so they don't really remember the last 7 days, but they can't even go backwards. So yeah, to them in that moment, they've never liked peanut butter and jelly. They just never did, because the past is not there anymore. It hasn't existed anymore. And if you really think about it, I was to ask you to go back and think about your earliest memories, for most of you, you might have a memory or two at 3 and 4, but you're really probably going to start really developing them about 5 or 6 is where you're going to feel a little bit more comfortable. In fact, some of those really early memories, if they're 3 and 4, we might question them. Are they really your memories, or is it that you've heard stories so often or saw pictures that you've now incorporated those into your memories? And the last thing for this key feature is the appearance of reality. Basically, if they see an object, they assume it to be real. So when they watch that television show, they think it's real. Now, this can be a problem because we know that lots of television is not real. And since they don't always know the difference between the appearance of reality and not, that could mean that they have led them to a few things they shouldn't have done. These days, people who develop cartoons are trying to be very careful not to put things in there that could later on cause children to unfortunately put animals in microwaves, thinking that the animal will be okay, or the coyote can fall off the cliff and just pop back around and be okay. Of course, that coyote walks on 2 legs, but it's the appearance of reality. This is also kind of interesting at Halloween. So they want to be Spider-Man, they want to be Spider-Man, they want to be Spider-Man. You get them a great Spider-Man costume, but they will not put on the mask because that means that's their face, and they don't want that to be their face. Or they get very upset because they see that you've maybe drawn a little flower on your face, and they're like, "Oh no, 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 no! You're not supposed to have flowers on your face." It's one reason why clowns look so scary to them, because that's not how people are supposed to look, and that's reality. And no, they look odd, they look wrong. That's not right. And so they have this real thing about appearance of reality. So Piaget began to realize that children have this ability, or at least this desire, to have inanimate objects have some sort of life or lifelike qualities. Things such as toys and teddy bears, they have feelings and intentions. What Piaget is really talking about is that for pre-operational children, the world is just basically naturally alive. It's conscious. It has purpose. It has meaning. It moves around. But he did develop 4 stages of ananism. Basically, up until about 5 years of age, the child believes that most everything is alive and it has a purpose. Um, Between 5 and 7, basically they begin to move from everything to that only objects that move have purpose. So they've sort of lost that a teddy bear has a purpose or is alive because it doesn't move. They would have to move it themselves. And then somewhere between 7 and 9, basically only objects that move spontaneous are thought to be alive. And that's, the dog is thought to be alive, but also there are other things that move spontaneous, and they may think that those are alive when really they're not. So a robot may be alive to them because it moves spontaneously. It's somewhere around 9 to 12, they get the concept that only plants and animals are alive. Now, here's again one of those criticisms of Piaget. People aren't arguing the stages, but what we have found is that children who tend to be more involved in animal care may develop this understanding sooner than others. So kids who work on ranches or live on farms tend to develop the concept that only plants and animals are alive faster than kids who may live in urban areas who don't have as much experience with that. What's interesting is that for most kids, understanding that a plant is alive can be very difficult, because how they have judged that animals are alive is they see breathing. We breathe, and we can see the dog breathe, and we can see the cow breathe. And even fish, it takes a little bit longer maybe, but they can see fish breathe because we explain the gills. Now they may kind of try to figure out how can fish breathe in water, and that may be confusing to them, but after a little bit they understand that there's a breath there. But plants don't breathe. And that's one reason why quite often kids have no problem destroying plants, because they don't really see them as alive. It just grows back. And that's usually what you have to use for kids to get them to kind of understand that plants are alive, because things grow back. They're inanimate objects like their teddy bear. If it lost an arm, it wouldn't just grow back. And that when I cut your hair grows back. So when your hair grows back, that's sort of the same thing as a tree when it gets its leaves back. And so that's almost what has to happen. Now, the other big thing in the pre-operational stage is play. And play at the beginning stage is often just engaged in what we call parallel play. That's to say, they often play in the same room as other children, but they only play next to them rather than with them. We tend to find that each child is absorbed in their own private world, and the speech is rather egocentric. That means is that they're basically just speaking to internalize or to externalize, I should say, their own private thoughts rather than to really trying to communicate with someone. Moreover, the child is not really grasping the social function of language or basically even what rules are. So when they hit toddler, though, they often begin to pretend to be people they're not. So we'll see the superhero, the policeman, things like this. They play these roles with props that they symbolize as real life objects. Now, children may also invent imaginary playmates at this time, and those who do make imaginary playmates often later on are seen to be far more imaginative and can think outside the box. So, most imaginary playmates go away, so it might be good for them to have it. Now, as a pre-operational stage develops and the egocentrism begins to decline, and now children are beginning to participate with other children in games, play becomes a lot more important to them. It has a social aspect. And so finally, as play becomes more important, there's this need for some way to regulate each child's relationship with the other children. And out of this need, we see the beginning of an orientation to others in terms of things like rules and socialization. Now, children can play games with more complex rules because they begin to understand the rules of society and the rules and roles that they play within that society. It may seem kind of silly that we're talking about attention. After all, everybody knows what attention is. But we're going to talk about psychology and attention. So let's think of attention sort of like this highlighter. You know, if you're reading through your textbook, you highlight sections to make it stand out, causing you to sort of focus your attention and your interest on just that one area. But attention is not just about centering your focus on one particular thing, it also involves ignoring stuff. In fact, ignoring a great deal of information and stimulus. So attention allows you to sort of tune out information, sensations, and perceptions that aren't relevant at the moment. And instead, it allows you to take your energy and focus on the information that's most important. After all, that's what you do with the highlighter, right? You're sort of saying these other sentences are not as important as this. And when I come back to this, I just want to look at this. And that's what attention does. Not only does our attention system allow us to focus on something specific in our environment while tuning out those irrelevant details, it also affects our perception of the stimulus surrounding us. With the other thing that's kind of interesting with attention is that attention also affects the development of the brain. Without attention, we know that children have difficulty developing fully functioning brains. So when little kids are basically kind of harassing you to get attention, it's not because they want it, it's because they must have it. Unfortunately, we've had situations in which young children have not been given attention for one reason or another, not always for neglect reasons, but sometimes neglect. And when they don't get that attention, we actually find that their brain doesn't develop correctly. They become intellectually disabled sometimes, even. So, attention is something that we absolutely use. The other thing that we use to help us sort of process our information and really begins to develop is habituation at this point. Now, remember, we're talking about preschoolers here, so they haven't had a lot to be habituated to. But habituation is said to present in almost every species of animals, including humans. So we all have it. Many factors that influence the emergence of I can't say that habituation in organisms tend to boil down to two things. One is the amount of time between the first presentation of the stimulus and the organism, and the second presentation of the stimulus and the organism. They call this interstimulus intervals. And then also the length of time during which the stimulus is presented, and this known as stimulus duration. So let's kind of break it down. You know me, I like to give you examples. So suppose there's two stimuluses, A and B. Now, the duration that you have for stimulus A, let's say that's cold air being blown on you, is for only about 10 seconds, while the stimulation for B is sort of louder music. Now, the concept of habituation would hold that the longer an organism is exposed to a stimulus, the less the stimulus will have an effect on them. That means is that if we were to come back and we hear noise and we hear cold, we'd be more likely to understand the cold and feel that than we would the noise, because we'd already been habituated somewhat to that noise. And because of that exposure we had, we're able to sort of ignore the noise a lot more than we can ignore the cold. So basically, a habit may sort of come into currents. You may have found, and some of you may find, that when you take tests, especially if you're on a campus taking a test, that it's too quiet. You're used to the noise being around you. You listen to music while you take tests. You do all these things because you've basically become accustomed to having that extra noise. And when that extra noise isn't there, you question whether or not things are going correctly because you've habituated to it. Now, I always say you have to be really careful about this, because if you're the type of person who quiet and annoys you, understand when you go to take your national exams, it's going to be quiet. So you need to learn perhaps how to study in a quieter place, or learn how to study without having a lot of noise on, or very little noise, because people aren't going to let you listen to headsets while you take your national exams. So one of the most interesting facts about this is that there's this decrease in response that's specific only to the stimulus in which the habit has developed. So if you haven't developed a habit, so you're not going to have this. So let's just say that you've been habituated to the taste of chocolate flavored ice cream. Your degree to the response of vanilla flavor is going to be significantly increased because you haven't had to develop the habit for vanilla yet. And so you go to the soft serve place and you always get chocolate, but now you get vanilla. You're like, oh, wow, this vanilla is really good. Is it really good, or is it the fact that you're used to chocolate, and so the chocolate isn't special anymore? So these things are also things that are occurring for the first time with a lot of our kids. Some kids who may be raised in very noisy neighborhoods have no problem with handling noise in other places, where a child who's been raised in a rather quiet place goes to a noisy neighborhood and that bothers them. And then you think, oh, there's something wrong with the kid because they're bothered by all this noise. No, they've just not used to it. And it bothers them because that's not what they have. You might live near like an airport or a train, and you become accustomed to the sound of that train coming by at certain times of the night, or that plane coming by. You don't even hear it anymore. So it doesn't really get your attention anymore. And that's basically what these concepts are. Now, we've already reviewed classical and operant conditioning in the other video, so we're going to spend a little bit more time on observational learning. Now, as most of you must already know from the title, that observational learning occurs by watching others and retaining the information and later replicating that behavior. Now, this learning happens indirect. Unlike classical and operant conditioning, which is direct learning, this is indirect. This type of learning can take place basically at any point in your life. And for many of you, you're going to be doing some observational learning as you move into your programs and you move into your labs. But it's strongest in childhood. Learning from family and friends and peers, authority figures, and so on. It plays an important role in our socializations as humans. Now, kids learn how to behave and how to respond to others by observing how we do it. And when I say we, we're not just talking about their parents. They're talking about what they see on television. We're talking about what they see from their friends. And they look to see how successful others are by using that basic behavior pattern. And if they're being successful, they may want to repeat that behavior pattern because they see it as a successful behavior pattern. Now, this is a primary learning method for most humans. Even as young as 21 days, We've seen kids imitate facial expressions and mouthing movements. So, this is something that comes naturally to us and probably has been with us since we've had the development of us as a species. But remember, I said that we basically see this as something that we see in almost all living creatures. So when you watch those animal shows and you watch the little baby cheetah, they're imitating what they see their parents do. Observational learning is probably one of the primary ways we pick up information that helps us survive on a day-to-day basis successfully. The question is what are they observing and what do they think is successful? This brings us to autobiographical memory. Now, this is uniquely a human system that basically integrates memories from the past into sort of this overarching life narrative we have about ourselves. It absolutely defines a sense of self as this kind of continuous in time. It links like this specific event or experience that you had in our own personal timeline, and that may stretch back to your past. And then we may link that to your present and even project it into the future. And we talk about your own personal timeline. Understand my timeline is going to be different than your timeline. So I'm going to link some event, and I'm old enough to be remember 9/11. I'm going to link that into my personal timeline. And for those of you who are old enough to remember 9/11, you linked it into your personal timeline. And so that's part of our autobiographical memory. Now, that's part of our past, but we also may bring it into the present when we think about things, and we may even use it to help us think about the future. So basically, this memory begins to emerge at the end of our preschool years. So we're just beginning to get this at the end of these chapters, but it may not be fully there, you might want to say, until your adolescence or early adulthood. Again, I always challenge people, go back and think about your early childhood. Think about, your elementary school days. Think about your junior high days. You don't have as much detail in those as you do in other areas of memory. So let's break this down a little bit. So auto I'm not going to even try anymore. This memory refers to our memory for specific episodes. Now, we call this episodic memory, and you can see episodic memory right here. Now, episodic memory is basically our stories. So think about episodic TV. They're stories each week. And what we have is we have this broken down into two more categories. We have some things that are basically emotional memories, and we have some that are non-emotional memories. Now, what we're talking about is that when we retrieve emotional memories, we tend to relive them. That's where PTSD can become a problem. And non-emotional memories, when we tend to re-experience them. But either one, they tend to be episodic memories. And this is sort of our conceptual, our generic knowledge of our lives. Basically, we typically kind of make it our biography. Now, these two types of long-term memory, the episodic and the semantic over here, there's semantic. And remember, hopefully, that semantic is sort of your words, your dictionary. It's also broken down into two types. You've got your personal semantics, and you think about the words that you use and how you tend to use them, maybe for yourself or within your own family groups. And then we have basically semantic events, where we have more of a shared concept of what that is. And so with these two primaries right here, they make up our autobiographical memories. That is really hard for me to get out. Anyway, they're brought together in an act to help us remember and form specific memories. Well, now let's talk about general, because when we talk about specific individuals, there's always going to be something that's a little different. Because remember, I said there is no absolute person who's this average. But generally, this information is categorized into three broad areas: what we call lifetime periods, general events, and event-specific knowledge. So lifetime periods are composed of this general knowledge about distinguishable and themes and time of an individual's life. So think of that as your high school years, as your college years, your elementary school years, the years I lived over here, the years I lived over there. So basically, our life is broken down in sort of these segments. Then general events are more specific than lifetime periods, and they encompass generally a single representation of a repeated event or a sequence of related events. So that would be Christmases, Thanksgivings, vacations. And then there's event specific knowledge. And this is usually vivid, detailed information about an individual event, often in the form of visual images and some sort of sensory perception features. So 9/11 would be an example of that. This is also where we have people who may develop PTSD even from one event. If you were raped, that's going to be an event like this. So this autobiographical memory starts around now, but it's going to continue throughout your life, and it gets broader and deeper the longer that you live. So now we come to the Russian. What's interesting about Mr. V's is that he almost has this very different approach to cognitive development than Piaget had. Basically, he states that social interactions are basically the key to cognitive development. He believes that a person sees in their community that plays a central role in the process of sort of making meaning of something. He argues that learning is necessary and universal aspect of the process of developing culturally organized, specifically human psychological functions. Now, that's his quote. It's a little gobbledygook, but let's break it down for a second. It says learning is necessary. Basically, he's saying is that we can't just stay like a baby. We have to be able to learn. We have to be able to progress. And that it's universal aspect of the processing of developing a culture. And that this is not just happening in one place, that it happens with all humans. That's what he means by universal. And that we all do this. And that we are all culturally organized in some way, and that cultural organization helps us in our psychological function, and we need to have psychological function in order to function as humans. So unlike Piaget, who tended to look at the individual, this guy tended to look at the social cultural aspects of life. So for him, social learning came before development. We had to learn the social aspects and then we could develop. His developmental theories were developed with that social cultural approach then that we talked about earlier in chapter 1. This approach states that no one thing can account for sort of that push for development. So think about equilibrium according to Piaget being sort of that push for development. He doesn't say there's one thing. In fact, that a person's development cannot be understood with looking at just this single aspect. We have to look at their society and we have to look at their culture and the context in which they develop in order to really understand the person. So unlike Piaget, V did not think that we had stages of development either. He assumes that cognitive development varies across cultures, whereas Piaget tended to see cognitive development mostly as universal. Now, let me go back for the word universal. What Mr. V said is that universally, we all develop because of culture within our societies. But he said is that our societies are different, thus we develop differently. Whereas Piaget basically gave dates and times and said it doesn't matter if you're living in New Zealand or Zimbabwe or Peru or the United States, you're going to develop about the same. So that was one of the biggest differences in there. Now, V also states that cognitive development stems from the social interaction or this guided learning that we have. And so this is where the intersubjectivity comes in. That within this community, all participants have sort of a mutual shared understanding of an activity. So if we're playing a game, the rules of the game. And when you don't understand the rules of the game, you aren't participating. And that if you want to participate, if you want to be part of the culture, which basically humans are social creatures, so they want to be part of it, I'm going to figure out the rules of the game. And that from this guided participation, we have this zone of proximal development. We'll talk about that in just a little bit in a moment. and that this zone of proximal development and their parents are going to basically construct knowledge. So what V said is that for the environment to function, children will grow up with influences of how they think and what they think about, and that this will be done through this guided participation. Basically, I will do some activities, whether it's learning how to ride a bike, or if it's learning how to talk, or if it's learning how to eat, with somebody who's a little bit more skilled than I, and that person will guide me, that person who's a little bit more skilled than I will guide me through that cognitive development. And that's where this concept of apprenticeship comes in. Basically, he looks at apprenticeship as sort of a natural element of culture and a natural element for humans. I mean, kids, they want to be with their parents. They want to be there because they see them as sort of an apprenticeship. That he believed that as more skilled people taught people that apprenticeship, that child would then develop, and it promotes cognitive development. Now, the apprenticeship doesn't always have to be with somebody who is much older. I use this picture just because I thought it was kind of a cute picture of Grandpa teaching her how to ride, because it really makes you think about this as being a cultural rounded area. But what he said is that you only even have to have a little bit more skill. So I don't like to make direct comparisons between Maria Montessori and him because they are slightly different. But Maria Montessori did sort of embrace this concept of someone being just even a little bit more skilled than you. They are contemporaries, they live about the same time. And that with her teachings, she often found that children who were a little better at something were often better teachers than people who were really good at something. And so adults quite often didn't teach something as well as another kid did to a younger kid. So her classrooms were often developed into having somebody who's maybe even just a year or two older teach a kid who was just a couple of years younger. So you might find like a third grader helping a kindergartner learn to read because they were sort of similar in mental abilities, because once we get to be adults, it's hard for us, almost impossible to go back and think like a little kid because our brains are too well developed. But somebody who is in third grade still remembers what it's like to be a kindergartner. At this point, we don't remember what it was like to be a kindergartner. We don't remember perhaps the frustrations or not understanding. But in an apprenticeship, the person who's just a little bit more skilled would know that. And all they have to do is be a little bit more skilled than you to be able to teach you how to get to the next level. So the zone of proximal development, which is really this important concept, relates the difference between what a child can achieve independently and what a child can achieve with basically guidance and encouragement from a skilled partner. So what he saw the zone of proximal development as an area which, most instruction should be given or guidance should be given, allowing the child to develop skills that they will use on their own eventually, helping them basically develop a higher mental function. Now, he also viewed the interactions with peers as an effective way to develop those skills and strategies, as we talked about. He suggested that teachers use cooperative learning exercises that were less competitive, basically, and let children develop them with help from more skilled peers. So, within that zone of proximal development. Now, this is something that we see are people who work in physical therapy or speech therapy or occupational therapy use all the time. And also, we're going to find a lot of nurses because right now, let's say that somebody has just had a hip replacement. So when they come to see you, we need to see what they currently can do. What can they do unassisted? Once we know what they can do unassisted, we begin to understand what they need to be able to do. So basically this line right here, there may also be some things that are basically out of reach for them. So I don't know exactly, but maybe they're not going to run a marathon anymore. So that's now out of reach for them. What we want to look at is this part right here. This is what the person needs to learn, and we're going to use something called scaffolding to help them get there. So what scaffolding basically is sort of the difference between what they currently know and what they don't know. And that's what we're going to work with. So we give them just enough assistance to match the learner's needs. I'm not going to be able to hold this person all the time while they're learning to walk again after they've broken their hip and had a hip replacement. Because at some point, they're going to have to be able to learn to walk for themselves. So maybe at first I use a belt and I help hold them up, but after a little while they've got to be able to hold themselves up or they've got to be able to do the exercises by themselves. And so now they're walking in the walker, they can go on a flat ground, but I also know that they need to be able to go up 2 steps to get into their house. And so right now they can't do it. So I'm going to give them a little assistance. I'm going to help them on those learning how to step up. And then once they've got that, we're like, woohoo, you got that. Okay. So now maybe we walk over and we begin learning how to walk down a couple of steps. Um, each time we're basically just scaffolding up to another bit of knowledge. And eventually maybe we even get them out of the walker and we get them to a cane. So that's what a zone of proximal development is. So we need to know where they're at, where they're going, and then you only teach the stuff in between. But you don't give them too much assistance, because if you give them too much assistance, basically they're not going to learn how to do it for themselves. So that's what scaffolding is. With the road to speech, we have a very, I don't want to say complex thing here, but it is rather complex. And our book kind of gives us a little bit of what this is. Those who are going to go into some fields where speech and development of speech is much more important, you'll get much deeper knowledge of this. For this class, we're going to sort of do like the brain. We want you to have some basic understandings and some basic knowledge that you can build on. So this is sort of your ABCs. So with the understanding that every baby who is born actually has the ability to speak any language in the world, that it all just comes down to which language was spoken to them, which sounds that they began to learn, then we can kind of begin to look how we put this all together. So we already know, as it says there, that very quickly we can distinguish between vowels and consonants, and that we can also understand that different languages has different senses, sounds. But what's kind of interesting is that we don't realize that kids are practicing them. But we've already said that by 21 months old, kids are basically imitating what we're seeing or what we're doing. 21 days, 21 days old. So with language being one of those things that is very important for humans in communication, we know that quite often kids are paying a great deal of attention to this. And we do this thing called infant direct speech, where we speak slowly and we exaggerate pitches and volumes for infants to take in, and they will begin to basically compensate that. Now, I like this little picture in the middle with this little baby on the phone, because the question is does this kid really have enough ability yet to talk? Probably not, but if we were to listen to him, he'd be sounding like he talks because he's got all the right tones and inflections. And if you've ever seen the videos of like the twins, little twin babies who talk to each other, you would swear they're having a conversation. But what they've really picked up is the tones and the sounds of language. They don't really understand it yet because they don't even understand symbolism yet. But we do know that it's sort of this ability to pick them up. Now, by the way, just as an interesting and totally side note, if you don't learn a language by the time you're 10, there is evidence that you will never be able to learn language. And unfortunately, we've had situations, abuse situations, where people haven't been spoken to. They've been kept sort of in dark basements, you might want to say. There's a couple of famous cases. And these people never really got the concept of language. Also, if you don't learn a language by the time you're 10, there's a great deal of evidence that you may never speak it as a natural speaker because you're going to be using memory to learn this rather than using synapses to learn language. So let's take kind of a look to actual speech. So those were just sounds. So about 2 months, we know you begin to coo. And at about 6 months, we begin to get babbling. And babbling we've known is absolutely proof that you're on your way to speech. Somewhere by 11 month, we begin to incorporate those tonal changes, that pitch of language they hear. That's where you saw that little kid on the phone, blah, 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 blah. And he sounds like he's making real language because he's already picked up the tone. Now, what's interesting is some languages are much more tonal than English is. English is not that big of a tonal language, but is there is a tone to it that helps us understand the words and the concepts. That's why people like to hear basically things rather than just read things. It's that tone that helps us. But in tonal languages, many of the Asian languages are tonal, the same sound, depending on the tone, might have a very different meaning to it. And in a way, we kind of have that. I mean, if you think about it, if I ask somebody, how do I look? And they go, oh, you look fine. Oh, you look fine. Yeah, you look fine, girl. Each one of those, because of the tone, we can pick up what their various meanings are. So, tone and pitch is something that the kids are beginning to repeat. So, this is kind of important. This is why songs are very important to us, and we understand songs. If I was to ask you what letter comes before the letter K, you're probably singing the ABC song right now to yourself. And if I was to change that song, you might have a very hard time trying to learn the ABC song anymore. So tone and pitch is something that happens to work with our brains, and our brains seem to be associated with that, which is why we really developed language that other species haven't developed. Somewhere around 12 months, we've already said that symbolism starts to come in, and we know this through Piaget. And then at that 18-month, we gain sort of the insight that words are symbols for objects. And up until about then, we might have some words, but we may not understand that those words actually represent something. From there, at about a year, we know that children usually start using their first words, mama, dada. Notice that they have this consonant vowel pairing with them. Now, one of the things I've always thought was kind of interesting was that mama and dada are sounds that tend to represent parentage. Now, in the United States, or at least with English, dada is going to be a father and mama is going to be a mother figure. But that doesn't always occur everywhere. Sometimes the da sound is with the female and sometimes the ma sound is with the male. But what's interesting is that this is a tone that is often used around the world to represent parents. And that may be, now this is a hypothesis. Remember, a hypothesis is an educated guess. And why is it educated? Because we can't go back in time yet. We don't really have time machines. That this was done because we had to understand who our parents were. I mean, we pretty much are sure that the brothers got sent away when they got to be sexually mature to another group, just like the great apes do. But we also wanted to know where our lineage was, and it became important to understand who our father was so that we wouldn't mate with our father, you might want to say. So, terminologies like mama and dada, those tend to be still pretty universal to represent something within our parents. So we get to 18 months and we have this sort of explosion, you might say. We begin to have a lot of words, but we begin to see this connection, 2 and 3 word sentences based on what they call a simple formula, the action and the actor, the actor, the action. Mama give, dada go. They've learned what words represent things, so they've got some nouns and they've got some verbs, and they will use them. By 2, we have a vocabulary of a few hundred words, but yet by 6, we have over 10,000 words. And what's really important is that by 6, we don't just understand grammar, we're using grammar. And we're not using memory, we're using grammar to help us function and formulate our sentences. Now, when we say grammatical rules, you may think of commas and periods, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the order of how we speak, the order of words come. So with English, we tend to have our adjective and adverbs before our nouns and verbs. And yet in other countries, we may have the adjective and adverbs after the noun and verb. One of the reasons that many people may find Spanish a little bit more difficult to learn if they weren't raised in it is that people will say, well, it feels wrong. It feels like the order is wrong because the order of how they put things together is different than the order than we put together. That's grammar rules. Basically, the rules of how we put things together. And think about it. You don't go to school to learn those rules. You pick those up as you hear things, which means that if you have difficulty in hearing or difficulty in processing this information, then that's going to lead to certain language issues. How do we teach a deaf person the word the? If they don't hear speech, how do you define the? Most kids learn the because they've heard it and they've seen it and it's used. So I've always thought this was kind of an interesting concept is, you know, how do you teach the concept of the to somebody who doesn't hear, to a, to a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old? Now, the last thing we're going to look at is something called fast mapping. Now, the process of rapidly learning new words by contrasting them with familiar words is called fast mapping. Now, this is an important tool that children often use during language acquisition. So here's a really simple example. Let's say a preschooler comes into the room and they've got 2 little stuffed toys sitting over there. And they're on the floor, and we say to them, "Hey, little Larry, could you go and get me the sloth?" Now, more than likely, if we're talking about a little preschooler, they'll know what a bird is. But Larry's never seen a sloth. He doesn't know what a sloth is, but he's familiar with the bird, so he knows that this is not the sloth. He knows that's a bird. So Larry will go over and he'll pick up this animal and bring it to me. Now, why has he done that? Because he's familiar with the creature and he's unfamiliar with the other one. And so the child is able to figure out what the sloth is. Now, what's really kind of cool about fast mapping is that this is this really effective way to learn new words and acquire them. Most children, if we were to ask them to do that exercise, perhaps within a week, if I was to ask them, "Hey, could you go get me the sloth?" or "What is this animal?" they would remember it was a sloth, which I think is really kind of cool. So what happens is we're using sort of elimination to get the fast mapping of words. Now, there's going to be this huge difference, though, in vocabulary ranges from a 25 to 250 words for an 18-month-old. Why is this vocabulary so different? Well, some people just have better memories as far as sound is concerned, and some are exposed to richer language in the environment. What we're talking about richer language is that we kind of know that most people can bump up one level to what they originally learn. So if the first word that that you learn is tummy, then you'll be able to go from tummy to stomach pretty easily. But if you started with stomach, you'll be able to go from stomach to abdomen pretty easily. So if we expose our children to larger words, larger variety of words, then they're going to be able to use those to create more words you might want to say. So I have an English professor as a mother, and the example I can give you is that she hated the use of word "a lot." She would always say that that's a very immature word, and so we would always be taught to use many, various, sundry. Now, most people do not use the word "a sundry," but it's a very natural word for me because those were the words we had. And then from a sundry, we could go duplicity and a whole bunch of really snotty sounding words because that was the next level up. That's what they're talking about. When we're exposed to a larger range of words, when we're younger, we'll be able to have even a larger range than normal as we get older.